Jesus had an ability to see differently than most of us see. Jesus, of course, had an expertise in people, and he could see what the rest of them couldn't see. And that was people were ready to be harvested into the kingdom. All right, get your Bibles out and turn to the book of John, John chapter 4. I'm going to be reading from there, just a few verses in just a moment. It'll be John 4, beginning with verse 34. And it is the first of two messages that we will be teaching under the vision point that we've mentioned the last couple of weeks, reviving hearts. Everyone say reviving hearts. Say there, reviving hearts. That's point one. There's 4 points. Point one is reviving hearts. And under this point, there'll be two messages, and I am honored to be able to share the first one. And of course, Dr. Ron will be here next week at the church picnic, and he'll be sharing the second message under this point next week. You know, we've been able to share some of our notes with each other. And, Wally, when you were sharing, I was thinking, because you were talking about our transition over to the International Church of God and how we can be of impact, just as they are being a blessing to us and, opening up their sanctuary for us to worship there, that reciprocally we can be a blessing to them, and there can be something that happened there. And as soon as you said that, I thought to myself, this phrase came up, Pentecostal 2.0. I thought, how about two full gospel congregations are coming together in one place, and who knows what God could do. So there's a synergy that can take place when we work together. Now, I'll be the first to say to you that I did not always have kingdom mentality. I'm ashamed to say that. I repent from that, and I have repented from that. At times, when you're pastoring a local church and your concern is the local church and your people and where it's headed and getting the job done and all the pressures that are upon you, it is very easy to think what many pastors do think, and that is territorially. But you need to be reminded that there is kingdom, that the kingdom is why we're here. Even as a local church, this local church's responsibility is to make sure that the causes and the values of the kingdom go forth. And that's where we need to be. And so whether it is our attachment with International in worshiping together there at their facility, or creating these messages with Living Stones, because Dr. Ron and I have this synergy. And so he sent me some of his notes for this message, and I sent him some of my notes for this message. And so we kind of got a little stew boiling here. And so hopefully it'll taste good. And so I don't know how many of my notes he's using. I'm using a couple of his insights. And so together you're going to get the synergy effect. You know, if one sends 1,000 to flight, how many does two send? 10. That's called synergy. One sends 1,000. Two normally would send 2,000, but that's not what the Bible says. It says that if two people can work together, more can be accomplished than if just one or they both work separately. So we are practicing that even this morning. So John chapter 4, reviving hearts, and we are being reminded that a part of our mission is finding those whose hearts are dead to the things of God and being used by the Lord to see them raised into newness of life, or finding those whose walk may be wayward or they're struggling and need to be brought back to the place of fervency and passionate relationship with the Lord. In fact, let me ask, how many of you here this morning know somebody who either needs the Lord or they need to get back on track? I mean, how many here? I mean, if you can't raise your hand, you say, well, I don't know that I know anybody like that. Then you need to get in the field again and find you somebody that can be your kingdom project. All right? I think everybody put their hand up. So you need to hear what the Lord is saying as we start this message, and we've entitled it, Daring Love Sees. Daring Love Sees. John 4:34, familiar words, listen. Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to finish his work. Do you not say there are still 4 months and then comes the harvest? Behold, I say to you, lift up your eyes and look at the fields, for they are already white for harvest, and he who reaps receives wages and gathers fruit for eternal life, that both he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together." Let me just stop there and just mention this. Do you see, Jesus is already saying this is a kingdom project. He's saying there are going to be some people that are going to be sowing into other people's lives, and they may have sowed for years. And yet someone else will come around and they will present, or they will witness to that person or present the gospel to that person, and they will receive the gospel. How many of you know it took both sowing and reaping? Now, I like to reap. Don't you? That's like payday. But hear me when I say this. We are responsible to sow. You may say to me, "Pastor, I have never won anyone to the Lord." Well, okay. I want you to. You may want to, but hear me when I say this. Whether or not you've ever reaped a harvest personally of seeing a soul come into the kingdom, you're still responsible to sow. Paul would say it later. He said, some sow, others water, but who gives the increase? The Lord gives the increase. So Jesus is starting this whole thing. He's saying there are those that sow, there are those that will reap, but we rejoice together. For in this saying, Jesus says, is true, one sows, another reaps. I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Now here's it gets good. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labors. Always remember that. You may win someone to the Lord, but you may not have been the full reason. There might have been somebody working that field before you ever got to that person. Keep that in mind. But we want to talk this morning on what I've entitled Daring Love Sees. Now, as we begin to think about what Jesus said here, we need to remember that his era was not all that different than our era. Now, I understand they weren't wearing suits and slacks and leather shoes like I'm wearing. They may not be wearing a dress or whatever article of clothing you're wearing today. They could have been wearing their toga or their sheet and sandals. And of course, it was a different era with regards to fashion and maybe technology. But the case can certainly be made that when it came to people and their need and how they lived and what it was that made them a human being and how they interacted with one another, the fact of the matter is his era really isn't all that much different than our era. In fact, you could make a case that Jesus' time period was more vile and more brutal perhaps than even ours. You find out that just as the Lord is timeless in his work towards people, so are people's sins and dysfunction. They're timeless as well. People of the first century still lied, cheated, stole. People of the first century still committed perversion and crime, just like people do in the 21st century. Their families were falling apart, just like 21st century families are falling apart. Their paychecks didn't make it far enough, just like some of our paychecks don't make it far enough. They faced corruption. We face corruption. They saw injustice. We see injustice. And so that era is absolutely no different than our era. But Jesus steps into that era. He looks at his disciples and he says something interesting. He says, lift up your eyes and look, the fields are white unto harvest. Jesus had an ability to see differently than most of us see. How did Jesus see the multitudes? Well, he looked at the multitudes as a field that was ready to harvest. Now, most of you have heard my farm stories before if you've been with me for any amount of time. It's been a while since I've shared farm stories, so I was feeling nostalgic, so I'm going to share a farm story. You know, growing up in my household, my mom was the only girl in a household of 3 other brothers. My grandfather was a farmer in western Kansas. All the sons grew up to be farmers, but my mom married the city boy, my dad. He went to the military, learned to be an air traffic controller, and so I grew up in urban city life. All of my cousins were farmers. And so for vacation, you would go and you would visit your grandparents and see your cousins, and they're all farmers, and I was the city boy, and I was enamored with the farm, because on the farm, it was kind of cool to be a young kid on the farm, because, they'll set you at about 10 years old on a tractor. As soon as your foot can push down a clutch, they'll put you on a tractor or put you in a pickup, and they'll let you drive. I'm not kidding. In western Kansas, you could drive. Those kids were driving down highways in pickups and grain trucks and sitting on top of these large John Deere tractors, because that's what you did. If you were a farmer's son, as soon as you could push down the clutch, you were driving. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Some of you guys probably grew up maybe in some of that. Well, girls did too, huh? All right. Praise God. They did. My aunt was out in the field just like the guys were. That's true. My uncle one of my uncles was a wheat and cattle farmer. And as soon as I was old enough, when I turned 12, junior high school, my parents every summer through junior high and through high school would ship me off all summer long, and I would work for my uncle on the farm. And it was hard work. Anybody that ever worked on a farm knows that, it's rigorous work. And he was a wheat farmer, a cattle farmer. And so I did this every summer. I don't know exactly how many acres he tended to. I think somewhere in the neighborhood of 1,000 acres of wheat. That's a lot of land. And I can remember when it came time to harvest. Now in western Kansas, what you would do is, now bear with me because this is going to be very important spiritually in just a moment. But when you would plant your wheat, you would plant it actually in the fall of the year. You would sow it. It would stay in the ground all through the winter. The snow would come. It would actually insulate the wheat, and then when it melted, all that moisture would enter into the ground. In the spring of the year, the wheat would begin to press through it, look just a little green there in those micro rows that the drill would put down the seed. And then as you got into the summer, it had turned into the stalk would turn brownish until finally the head would come to it, and the kernels would begin to be formed in the head. And right around the 4th of July, you would see the head on the stalk of wheat begin to drop like that. And you would know at that particular time that it was getting close to being harvested, because the kernel in the head of the wheat was coming to fruition. It was finally being formed, and it wasn't just empty, but as soon as it formed, it would drop like that. And whenever my uncle would see the heads of the wheat stalks drop, he knew that the field was becoming ripe unto harvest. It was almost ready to cut. And so maybe he would cut just a little bit and try to find the moisture level in it. But as soon as it was ready to cut, when you had that many acres to cut, you had to be wise. The reason being is you couldn't cut the wheat too soon because it would be too wet. And if it was too wet or there was too much moisture in it, and you put it in a Quonset or one of those grain towers, it would spoil in the tower because of the moisture. But if you waited too long to cut it, it would dry out until finally it would become nothing. It would just be dust. And so there was this window of time between it being too moist and being too dry that you had to cut that stuff and you had to get it out of the field. That was why for many farmers, particularly those that had large quantities of wheat to harvest, you would run a combine. You'd actually have 2 or 3 combines that would run side by side. You would run those machines all night long for 2 weeks straight, never stopping. To sleep, you'd simply switch out drivers. I watched where you would switch out drivers while the combine was moving. You'd switch it out on the run. That's what we're talking. We're talking that you couldn't even spend 5 minutes switching out a driver. Because when it was harvest time, you got to understand, on the farm, that's payday. You put something in the ground almost a year previously, it's finally come to fruition, you got to bring that thing in because that's your payday. That's when you pay the bills. That's what you're going to live off for the next year, because you're going to start that whole process again. And so when you read these words, when I read these words about Jesus saying that lift up your eyes, the fields are ripe unto harvest, there's so many images that begin to spin in my mind when I think about what he was trying to communicate with them. Because Jesus, a lot like my uncle, was looking at the sea of people, and Jesus, of course, had an expertise in people, and he could see what the rest of them couldn't see. And that was people were ready to be harvested into the kingdom. People were ripe, and there was a window with which they must be harvested. Now, I just put down here because sometimes I think it's just good to review this. What does the word ripe mean? Ripe. This is what I put down. Ripe, simply answered, means they're ready for picking. Ripe. In this dysfunctional, brutal world that Jesus and the disciples were working in, he said that this time was the time to start harvesting souls. It was God's payday, so to speak. The Lord had an investment in the earth. It was time for him to receive back from his investment. It was the moment that he would receive his heart's desire. It's interesting, as I was just beginning to just meditate on it, how the kingdom of God is notorious for paradox. I've told you this before. You know what a paradox is. You say something that it doesn't appear like it could be that, or it could even sound like it's the exact opposite of what you're saying. For example, when Jesus said, "He that loses his life will save it. And he who saves his life will" what? Lose it. "The first shall be, and the last shall be. He who desires to be great must be a servant, and he who serves will be greatest of all." So that's what a paradox is. It really doesn't make sense to the natural mind. And there's all sorts of paradoxes in the Bible. And I thought to myself, how paradoxical this looks. Because Jesus is looking at this massively dysfunctional world. This world that is broken, dysfunctional, it's brutal, it's vile. They're doing things to themselves and to each other that are destructive. And he says, the fields are ripe. They're ready to be harvested. The disciples had to be scratching their heads, trying to reconcile what they were looking at and what Jesus was obviously seeing. It didn't make sense, I don't believe, to some of them. But Jesus saw people, even in this massively dysfunctional state, as being ready to hear what he was sent to say. It's interesting that in verse 38, that's exactly what he was saying there. He was saying, get ready, the harvest, it's time for the harvest to come in. Now this is where I just want to land this morning. And I want to give you just 5 things that I think we need to get better eyes on. Jesus had the capacity to look at a world and see something that I don't think we always see. In fact, I don't think anyone would argue with me that Jesus had a heart that was full of love. We talked last week about what true love really means. He had daring love, and he's transmitting this to his disciples. He wants this transmitted to you and to me. And out of this daring love, he has the ability to see differently into the world than I think sometimes we have the ability to see. I don't know about you, but it's real easy for me to look at our world and to just simply say, Lord, I'm amazed you haven't developed a scorched earth policy, actually. I look at the world and I say, I don't understand how you can watch people just thumbing their nose at you and walking their own way and doing what they do and just doing vile, blasphemous things. It says you're great in long-suffering and mercy, so it's a good thing you're God and I'm not, because I don't know that would be good. Jesus had the capacity to see something I don't think we always see. And I just want to sensitize us to this. And they're just 5 things. It may not take me long to go through this, but it'll be long enough that I think you'll get the point about daring love. How does daring love see in our current cultural climate? Number 1 is this. It sees a harvest and not a headache. It sees a harvest and not a headache. Does anyone here have a job, or maybe you've had a job, where you had to work with the public? Yeah. I maintain that everybody needs to work with the public for at least a couple years in their life. Nobody should ever have a job that you get to go to some cubicle and just sit there and never have to interact with anybody. Because you do not understand what it's like to work with the public. Everyone needs to work with the public. And after you work with the public, this is what I found out. As soon as I worked with the public, because when you do farm work, and I did some other work, and I'd never worked with the public for years, and so you don't have a sympathy really for those that have to work with the public. So once I started to, because I had early in my life I sold suits at JCPenney, and I had to work with the public. Let me tell you something. After that, I have a compassion on salespeople. I ask salespeople, do you get commissioned on this? Because if I don't buy today, I want to make sure I find you next time. I know what that feels like. I know what it feels like to have people just, work you over and rip you off, and, that's people. And if you work with the public, you get it. If you have never worked with the public, you really don't understand that. That's why I can always tell, especially at restaurants, when I watch people treating their servers, I can tell you who works with the public and who hasn't. Because usually those who don't know how to treat a server are those that have never worked with the public. But Jesus had the capacity, he worked with the public. And he yet still had the capacity to look at this landscape of people, and he didn't say, "You're giving me a headache." He saw a harvest. It's interesting to watch a farmer and how he relates to his fields. If you are a corn farmer, there's much more to do than some other crops. For instance, if you're a corn farmer, which is why I was glad my uncles were never corn farmers, because it's way more difficult. A lot of cornfields have to be irrigated, which means, that means turning on a faucet and irrigating your crops, and you have to make sure you're irrigating correctly. And then you would have to detassel, and maybe some of you even have done this. If you're, my age, you may remember detasseling. They would send usually a group of kids to go down a row of corn, and you detassel corn because there was a pollination effect that would take place. And they gave you knives. They gave 12-year-old knives, like, machetes. And you would cut the tassels off. And I mean, to work a cornfield, it was a job. It was a hot, tedious headache of a job. However, it's interesting that the farmer didn't look at his cornfield and say, "This is a headache." I really don't like cornfields. In fact, I hate cornfields. I don't even want to deal with cornfields. A farmer doesn't think that way. Why doesn't he think that way? It's because he knows that cornfield holds his harvest. It holds the promise of all the work that he's put into it. It brings him joy because that's the resources that will come to his household. Well, Jesus is the same way with people. There are scores of things that people demand, which causes the most compassionate of us a headache. I mean, you work with people, and it's remarkable. It's remarkable what people will do. I can't even start telling stories. I've buried them in the seas of forgetfulness, and so I cannot bring them up again. It is amazing. You want to be compassionate, but you work with people after a while, and they'll twist your compassion, and they'll abuse your mercy, and they'll take advantage. And people are like that until finally you just say, "You know what? Just go crash your life." If you're hell-bent on going off the cliff, far be it from me to stop you. That's how you feel at times. But daring love sees a harvest. And if you want to be a part of the reaping team of the kingdom, then you're going to have to see that and not just the headache of people's issues. Now, I understand you can't be manipulated and twisted and used forever by people. So I understand that. But at the same time, you need to understand that if you're working the field that Jesus has called you to work in, we've got to get eyes that begin to look at the dysfunction and look at the blasphemy and begin to say, there's a harvest there. I know people are running from God. I know people are going exactly the opposite. What we don't see is that the Lord is after some of them. There's a harvest out there, and we need to get eyes for it. Number 2, daring love sees potential and not necessarily the problem. It's very close to the first one, but it's a little different. It sees potential and not a problem. When you're looking at broken, dysfunctional, even despicable people, it can be hard to see beyond that moment. Add on top of that your personal disappointments and experiences, and oftentimes all you can see when you look at people is a problem. Yet Jesus had the ability to see potential in people and not just the problem. Can you imagine what the Lord's imagination must have been like to have looked at the original 12? To have called them to perpetuate the ministry. Jesus would have had to have seen potential. Otherwise, all he would have seen was doubters, ego trips, traitors, betrayers. And he probably would have looked at him and said, there ain't no way, this thing isn't going anywhere with this group. That is what daring love does. It must have the eyes to see the potential of what God could do if he got a hold of their heart. Daring love is what Jesus did to Simon Bar-Jonah. You remember when he asked the question, who do people say that I am? And a few of them gave answers like, well, some say you're Elijah, some say you're like a prophet. And it was Simon Bar-Jonah who said, thou art the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus says, blessed are you. And then he says his name, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you. And then all of a sudden, Jesus switches his name. And what does he call him? He calls him Peter. Because Simon meant little stone, but Peter meant big rock. And so Jesus was looking at Simon, and all of a sudden he saw something different. He said, Simon, no longer will you be this little stone, but I see something more than just a little stone. I see a big rock. In fact, he would say that upon this rock I can build my church. In other words, I can build something in you. I can use you. I can work through you. Jesus sees the potential. 35 years ago, when I was going through college and beginning my study for the ministry, as you recall, when I was born again, I was the first one out of my family that the Lord plucked out. And so I wasn't supported a lot, and there were a lot of hassles in my household. My parents were not, at that time, supportive of my following the Lord or even studying for the ministry. And so I not only had the normal 18, 19-year-old issues to eclipse, but I had the extra pressure of my household not being supportive either. And yet the Lord had done something deeply profound in my life. And so I went to college and I went off to a private school. It was a denominationally related school. And so I mean, my whole life was set up in such a way that there was just great adversity that I was going to face all around me. A professor there by the name of Barth Smith, he just recently retired. He'd still been teaching up to this time. Dr. Smith, for whatever reason, and I didn't get it at the time, but for whatever reason, he took an interest in me. I was saved, and I was converted. But how many of you know you can be saved and converted, and you can still be pretty raw? And I suspect I was a lot more raw than even I thought I was raw. And I remember that for whatever reason, he just took an interest in me. And with no support system or anything else, he would let me hang out. I could hang out in his office. He'd preach on the weekends. He would go to churches in the area, and he'd call me up and he'd say, "Hey, you want to ride with me? You want to come with me?" And so as we'd ride down the road, we'd talk about the ministry. We'd talk about the sermon he was about ready to give. And afterwards, as we were driving back, we'd kind of debrief. And I didn't get it. I just knew I got to hang out with him, and I didn't even understand what was going on. But what he was doing was he was discipling me, and he was mentoring me. And I wasn't getting it. I see it so clearly now. And I suspect if we could have Dr. Smith here today and do an interview with him, and you were to ask him the question, tell us about Pastor Baird when he was 19. I'm sure you would be delighted with the stories to hear as to his analysis of me at 19 years old. But here's the point that I think that's important was, and that is, no matter what anyone else saw, there was somebody, Dr. Smith, who was able to look through the raw. He was able to look through the rough edges. He was able to look through all of that and all the problems and all the other, and believe me, it wasn't like there was anything I brought to the equation that was going to help him out. But he was able to look through all that, and he got the eyes of potential. There's some potential here. And I'm sure I know I disappointed him along the way. But yet, there was still potential. And that's what daring love does. Daring love doesn't ignore the problem, but somewhere along the way, it sees the potential. In fact, a couple years ago, I dropped him a note, and I just felt like I needed to thank him for seeing the potential while I was getting my act together. And, I was rebuked, I was corrected, I was yanked around. There were times I didn't like it, but the fact of the matter is, now that I'm almost 56 years old, I appreciate what a man did when I was 19, when he had the eyes to see potential in me, and he decided he wasn't going to let the problems dissuade him. That's what daring love does. Number 3, daring love sees a response and not a rejection. It sees a response and not a rejection. In order to see a harvest, there is the assumption that people will want to receive the good news. Did you get that? If there's a harvest out here, then the assumption is people want to receive the good news. So when you interact with people, do you presuppose they will reject the gospel, or do you suppose they will receive the offer? How do you go into that thing? Honestly, I have to remind myself that there's a harvest out there that wants to say yes to the gospel. Daring love needs to believe that people really want to hear good news. If we had that presupposition, perhaps we'd dare to share it more. Jesus believed people would say yes to what he had to offer. And so we need to believe that people want to do the same thing. I admire salespeople. Remember earlier when I said to you that you can't really understand people unless you work with the public? Let me tell you something. I have a heart for salespeople because I was in sales, and I'm not a salesperson. I'll just admit it. I'm not a salesperson. I'm not a very good salesman. Some people are great salespeople. But you know what makes a great salesperson? A great salesperson is one who can hear 50 no's, but they'll still keep going for that one yes. That's remarkable. It just amazes me when I watch salespeople that hear no after no after no. They have to shake off all the no's that they hear because in their mind, it wasn't the 50 no's. They're looking for the one yes. They're saying to themselves, all right, they didn't want it, but I'm still looking for that one yes. If I can just find the one yes. I've tried to start doing that in my own life. I say to myself, when I start a conversation with someone about the Lord or about the gospel, that what I am doing is that I'm simply identifying who the Lord has been working on before I arrive on the scene. Boy, I hope you heard that because that was really good. What I'm doing is simply identifying who the Lord has been working on before I arrived on the scene. You see, I'm not responsible for saving anybody. I'm not responsible for drawing anybody. I'm not responsible in any way, shape, or form other than being the conduit through which the message gets shared. So all I have to do is I don't have to find the hardest one in the bunch, although it could be the hardest one is the most open. I don't know. But this is how I've started going about it. If I get no's or I get rebuffed or if I get people who just roll their eyes at me or they don't want anything to do with me, all I say to myself is this: oh, okay, well, obviously Jesus isn't working on them at this moment. I've still got to find the one Jesus is working on because he's working on somebody around me. And all I have to do is find that one in order to share with them. It's the Lord's business to deal with people. I'm simply tracking down the ones that need to hear what it's all about. And what I've been finding is that there are far more people that the Lord is dealing with than I ever imagined. This past week, my wife and I, we had to pick up a small little piece of furniture that we were needing, and so we were just kind of browsing around in this store and looking for something, and the salesperson came up, and sometimes you just hit it with salespeople. Of course, they want to make a sale, so obviously they want to hit it off. But what was interesting was, she said, well, what's y'all's name? And my wife said Tracy, Kevin, and her name was Gracie. Gracie, meet Tracy. Tracy, meet Gracie. And we just began to share. And when you're doing this kind of thing, eventually someone gets around to, well, what are you getting this for? And why are you getting this? And what are you doing? And why are you here? And Where have you come from? And all of a sudden these questions come up, and all of a sudden it's the perfect open door to begin to share the gospel, to share what the Lord's doing in your life. And all of a sudden what you find is people, I'm finding this now so many times, people who will suddenly, they'll just drop their head and they'll go, you know, I'm just telling you Gracie's story. My great-grandfather was a preacher. My grandfather was a preacher. My father was a preacher. And I hadn't been to church in a long, long time. And I said, well, you know something? Gracie, it's this moment is God saying to you, it's time to fix that. It's time to fix that. Because whatever's wrong can get fixed. No, I don't know where you've been, what you've done, or how deep you've sunk. You know, because you've heard it, that where sin abound, grace doth more abound. And you can be reached to by the Lord, and He can cleanse you and pull you out and set you back on the place that you once were, if you'll let Him. And all of a sudden, there's this conversation that starts up. And cell numbers are exchanged. And now I have this furniture lady that calls me up on the phone wanting to know. See, it's the harvest. It's not just buying furniture, it's the harvest. It's not just going to the grocery store, it's the harvest. It's not just being at school, it's the harvest. We've got to understand it's not just walking the dog around the neighborhood, it's the harvest. Do you have eyes to see? Number 4, daring love sees opportunities, not obstacles. Opportunities, not obstacles. Did you catch Jesus saying in the text that there were voices saying, hey, you got 4 months. There's yet 4 months for the harvest. Jesus said, that's what y'all are saying. There's yet 4 months to the harvest. What that means is they were saying, well, we got plenty of time. There's no sense of urgency. There's no need to feel like time is of the essence. But the Lord says the time for the harvest is now. I want to ask you, do you feel urgent about the gospel? Is there anything that causes you to feel like time is of the essence? Do you hear what Jesus is saying when He's saying, you're saying there's plenty of time to get to it, but He's saying, actually, there's not as much time as you think. That is why when He looked at the harvest, He saw opportunities, not obstacles. That's why when Paul, in the book of Acts, we just went through the book of Acts, how many of you know if you got thrown in jail, if you were like Kim Davis and you got thrown in jail, like Paul was thrown in jail, how many of you would see that as an obstacle? You would say to yourself, this is not maybe a prime, opportune moment. And yet Paul's thrown in jail, and what happens? God supernaturally moves, and He gets the Philippian jailer saved. Maybe God's wanting you to start a prison ministry, and that's why you got thrown in jail. Who knows? But it's not an obstacle, it's an opportunity. Why were you fired? Were you fired because somebody hated you? I don't know, but it's not an obstacle, it's an opportunity because He's going to give you a new field to work in. You got to get kingdom eyes. Daring love sees it that way. We're being promoted into other harvest fields. We need to get eyes for that. And then finally, number 5, daring love sees, and I'll define this word, myriads and not minimums. Myriads and not minimums. The word myriad means innumerable. Myriad means untold numbers that you can't count them. A harvest is not like planting. You know, when you plant a seed, how many of you know that when a seed goes in the ground, there's just one? But when that seed grows, like a wheat stalk, I mean, I don't know how many, there's probably 10 kernels on a wheat stalk out of one seed. If you plant one kernel of corn, what you have is, you know, at least 1 or 2 corn cobs on that thing that maybe have 100 or more kernels on that. Which, by the way, why do they call it corn on the cob and not kernel on the cob? Have you ever wondered that? That's never made sense to me. But the point is this, you plant one, you tend to one, and you get multiple happenings off that one when you harvest. Now, the reason that's important, and we're going to end with this, is to simply remind you there are more people than we at times imagine who are ripe for the gospel. I will be the first one to plead guilty to a remnant mentality. The days we are living in America make you feel like that it's you and maybe just a few others that have their act together and they're living all out for the Lord. But Jesus, it says here, saw a harvest. He saw an innumerable harvest. He didn't see minimums, he saw myriads. The book of the Revelation, John said this, when he saw the harvest coming into heaven, he says, I saw a number no man could number. You do understand, don't you, that this nation is headed for a crash if an awakening does not intervene. Now, personally, I hope this nation does not crash. But truthfully, when the pain of a rebellious culture lands at our own doorstep, I can assure you that people's hearts will be open to the gospel. I watched on 9/11 as people streamed to the house of God. I realize our hearts are much more hardened and they're much more deceived than they were on September 11th, 2001. But I can assure you this, that there's enough pain in the earth that can be loosed upon America that people's hearts will get soft in a hurry. And that won't be a problem. That won't be an obstacle. That'll be an opportunity. That'll be potential. That'll be the ripest moment the church has ever known to present the gospel. Amen. Now, I realize the church that comes to church in order that they can just personally be blessed and received and figure out how they themselves can prosper and all the stuff is about them. I understand that they'll look at it all and they will whine and complain and wonder why their formulas didn't work. But the church that has the eyes of Jesus in the midst of adversity will see that as a prime moment. Because we are not here for our personal comforts. We are here on kingdom assignment. And if the kind of pain that is coming to America turns out to be what I think it will be, I can assure you that people are going to want to hear and respond to everything we're saying. Now, I want to read you something, and this is where I'll end. I'm going to finish with this. I want to read a verse in John 19, verse 25, and I'm ending with this. Jesus is on the cross, and he's talking while he's hanging on the cross. And it says this, John 19:25, it says, Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother, and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Now listen, he's on the cross. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her to his own home. Now, I'm going to end with this. Listen very, very carefully. I want you to stop and think for just a moment all that was going on when Jesus was hanging on the cross. Those of you that went through Encounter, you remember Mel Gibson's Passion and the pictures that are indelibly etched in our minds as to what Jesus faced before he ever got to a cross. Imagine he's on the cross, skin ripped into shreds. He's been beaten. His eyes are probably swollen. He's been beaten by rods and sticks, and he's on the cross. It's the most horrific ordeals which would have killed a lesser man. And if there was ever a moment in the life of Jesus where he had every right to be focused on himself and what he was going through, it would have been this one. Would you not say that if there was ever a moment that a person could kind of be self-consumed, it's the moment when most of your flesh is simply hanging to the bone? I mean, I think at that moment, most everyone would understand that you probably have a legitimate right to be thinking about yourself. Your body's torn to shreds, your bones are broken, you're bruised, you're disfigured, you don't even look like the same person you were. The crown of thorns, you're on the cross, there's stakes through your hands. I mean, go on and on and on. If there was ever a moment he could have been thinking strictly about himself, it was that moment. And yet, despite all that he faced, despite his own personal need, hear me, he saw John's need. I thought about that. I thought about really what has happened to you that's been so massively hard and difficult, unjust and unfair. What has happened to you? I'm not suggesting it wasn't. All I'm suggesting is what has taken place in your life that is so massive that you aren't willing to get your eyes maybe off yourself and begin to see the need around you. That's daring love. It's daring love. I'm called to be like my master. I want to be like my master. In order to be like my master, I may be hanging on some crosses, not looking at myself, but maybe looking at the harvest. That's what daring love does. Daring love sees. Do you see? Will you see?
Release the